Final news topic of the week that we're going to discuss, and I guess it's games adjacent, but it's certainly something that's slightly concerning. LG has discontinued production of all of its Blu-ray players, and this follows in the wake of other people like Samsung, for example, also dropping support for
Hmm.
the Blu-ray format. John, you read this news with some level of concern, and I guess it is games adjacent, bearing in mind that the only real way to preserve games on the console space fully and completely is via Blu-ray discs right now. And the fewer
Hmm.
the lower the demand for Blu-ray disc players in general, the fewer of them will be made, which may well have a bearing on whether there will be a physical disc option available on next generation consoles.
Yeah, it's just the general state of physical discs, Blu-ray discs. It's a bit concerning given this. So, first of all, no actual new players had been produced by LG since like 6 years ago or something.
Yeah.
So they've been selling older models, and nobody's really taken the step to develop new ones. And now, along with Samsung and Oppo, they're also opting out now, and they're done making them. So that just leaves companies like Panasonic and Sony, and a few others still out there releasing these, and they also haven't updated their lineup in a long time. But the thing about this is concerning because then this also incentivizes studios to not bother with Blu-ray releases, which I know streaming is quote unquote good enough in many cases. It does look fine by and large, but you still get better picture and certainly audio from a disc. And for movies that you really care about, it's nice to be able to have that option. I think it should remain an option, but it's becoming difficult. Like when you go shopping at a store, especially in like America now, like you just barely can find these things anywhere.
Yeah.
It's you're relying on online ordering. Even then, they're often sold out. It's a little better over here in Europe, but still, it's not as good as it should be. Furthermore, a lot of the cheaper UHD players just have issues. I've talked to so many people that they've actually struggled to get through certain movies. They just don't play right, and it's absolutely insane that this plagues players at all like this. I've not had that issue, but I also have an extremely expensive UHD Blu-ray player that does actually work very well, but one should not have to go to that level to get good playback.
What is the
So,
model?
it's the Panasonic UB9000.
Okay.
So, which is a really solid player. I'm really happy with it. I've been using it for years. Um, the ones that I've heard a lot of the Sony players have issues with like movies struggling to even finish, which is not good.
Wow.
That's not good at all.
What about the PS5? Because obviously that's
PS5
probably
actually does okay, and the Xbox Series X also pretty okay, other than the software side being a little bit finicky. Like I've had issues with them on Xbox. It's done some weird stuff with the software, but when the software is working, it plays fine. Basically, it's harder to play these discs than it should be, and it's also harder to find them than it should be. And as a result, it really feels like everyone's just sort of shrugging and being like, "Yep, streaming." But the problem with that, of course, is that with the full control over where the movie appears, it's very easy for films to just disappear, and you're like, where can I watch this? Oh, it's nowhere. Like there's no
yes.
official way to buy this or watch this or do anything with this at all. They can just decide to pull it back, and it's done. And that sucks, which has actually in turn brought back things like piracy, where you kind of have to rely on piracy now to obtain certain movies because they just lock you out of the ability to get them, which is
It's
nuts. And
outrageous.
discs basically provided a way around that. And if they're becoming less popular and slowly drying up and nobody's making new players, and part of the problem with the UHD players I've always had is that the cost of the players was too high. And as I noted, a lot of the lower end models, which should be adequate, by the way, they're not. They have problems. And I think that's just nonsense. So like the ball was fumbled badly and nobody made a course correction on it. And this is where we're at now. And that really sucks. And game consoles are kind of the easiest way, I guess, for this to work now, because if you have a disc-based console, you can still play these things. Heck, probably the cheapest way to get into UHD Blu-ray is to go hunt down like an Xbox One S or something, right?
Right. Yes.
It does do it. It plays
Yep.
fine. That option is there. But yeah, the thing about UHD,
scaling back of hardware basically does mean inevitably there'll be a scaling back of software. That's, unless it is the case that the PlayStation 5 basically becomes the default player effectively. But yes, fewer options on the hardware side will inevitably send the message to manufacturers that there isn't a market there. That's deeply concerning.
Exactly. That's concerning. And I feel like the format was really good. I love UHD Blu-rays. The quality is awesome. And for the first time in a disc medium, they're region free. You can use them from any country, anywhere. That's amazing. Blu-ray region codes suck, dude. It's such a pain in the butt on those. And DVDs had it as well, but it was easy enough to defeat, thankfully. So I don't know. I'm just bummed out in the direction we're going. And I know a lot of people are like, yeah, well, you get with the future, buddy. But like I said, companies then gain full control, and they control what you're allowed to watch and when you can watch it. And sometimes those things just disappear. It's good to have options, and we're losing them.
There's something quite different there versus gaming, right? Which is the complete removal of access to particular content. And it's not, it just doesn't really make sense to me. I mean, let's face facts. In the here and now, so to speak, if you want to play a particular game on a PlayStation or an Xbox, that game is available to buy digitally, right? I mean, you might be ripped off compared to a disc version, as we've discussed at length in the past. But the point is, you have access to the content. It is there. If they're actually withdrawing Blu-ray movies, or rather withdrawing the streaming versions of these movies, and there are certain movies that you can't access anymore, absolutely that's a problem. And if they're going to be withdrawing the option to physically own a copy of the content, that's a problem. And you're quite right. The inevitable consequence of it is going to be a return to piracy. It's that simple.
It's that simple.
In terms of the implications for gaming, obviously, we've seen with the launch of the PlayStation 5 Professional that in a best case scenario, we're looking at an optical drive as an optional extra, a situation that's likely going to persist into the next generation based on that, which is not great. I guess the one thing to point out is that, Sony make their own drives, don't they? They make their own optical drives. So, the concept of LG and Oppo and Samsung withdrawing from the market doesn't really have a bearing on whether there will be an optical drive for, say, PlayStation 6. It's whether Sony wants to do it, which I think is slightly concerning at this point. Any thoughts on this, Oliver?
Yeah, I think it's not a great sign about the sign of the times there, but really, when you think about it, games are kind of the last bastion for ownership-based models in media, period, and certainly physical media ownership in general, I think. That's reflected in this news. As long as Sony makes the drives, they can continue to supply them, for sure. But I'd be curious to see what that actually would look like for PS6. Like, I could see them continuing to ship some kind of disk drive option. For older games, I'd be surprised to see PS6 games on a disc, personally. I think that's probably unlikely. For Microsoft, I think that it's just completely dead in terms of physical distribution. I think they have no interest in it. Nintendo, though, it's kind of interesting here. It's a separate kind of question there, but I'm curious to see what that looks like, if there's an install process for the carts. We know they're using carts again. I am worried that we're going to see a lot of games using digital downloads there, using the carts as kind of a verification check, a validation check. Because I like, when I don't, I'll admit my software library on current-gen consoles and Switch is almost entirely digital. But when I have bought games physically for Switch in particular, I've liked it because it's a little cart. It can hold all the game on it. If I really like a game, I might get the cart for it, get the box, get that nice little collector thing going on there. Like for the recent Ace Attorney trilogy, I bought that on cart there. And I get all the game, and I can plug it into any Switch console, and I know it will run immediately. there's like a certain immediacy to that you lost even with PlayStation 4 and Xbox One with the discs.
Yep.
And now it seems like you're going to be losing all that entirely. So I just hope that as Nintendo continues to support physical media, they support it hopefully, and developers continue to support it hopefully in the way that we'd like to see, which is games on cart, being able to play them immediately, that kind of stuff. I mean, Nintendo's cart pricing makes that maybe challenging for some games, unfortunately, possibly, but I hope that continues to be mostly the case, at least.
If I had to make a prophecy, I will say that games obviously will persist on physical media on Nintendo Switch 2, and I think that you'll be able to run the game from the cartridge as opposed to it installing onto the internal media, because I just don't think that kind of model works for Nintendo. They're kind of wedded to the console experience, which is as close to plug and play as you're going to get these days. And also, if there's only like the mooted 256 gigs of memory on Switch 2, that could fill up very, very quickly, and again would be detrimental to the gameplay experience if you're always having to shuffle games on and off, especially if you own the cartridge. That would be kind of nuts. Don't know what you think about that, John, but I just think Nintendo would, thankfully, are quite traditionalist in this sort of thing.
I mean, yeah, that's one of the reasons I like Nintendo these days a lot.
Right.
So they, them being out of date is actually beneficial for me. They suck it online and they love physical media.
I think there's a lot of different dimensions to this, which is that they do have a younger audience, and the physical media is declining at a much slower rate on Nintendo Switch than it is on the other platforms, and I think they're going to want to continue to service that audience. Also, the concept of kids swapping games, that's kind of something that's disappeared from like the PlayStation and Xbox, but Switch, I can still see that as a viable scenario that would be one of the reasons why you'd buy a game.
Plus, like, people still go to stores, right? Like, maybe there's less of this stuff around than there used to be in some countries, but like having a shelf presence is not something you should underestimate. And when you walk into stores, Nintendo still has a huge shelf presence. You feel it. You feel the Switch there. You see that red banner. You see all those games. It sits in your mind, even if you don't buy it that time. I feel like this is the year where Xbox basically vanished from stores. Like, it's all but gone. And like, to the average game player that just walks in, that doesn't really track the industry, the Xbox may as well not even exist anymore as it's presented in these stores. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's going to destroy their business or anything, mind you, but it definitely has an impact on the mind share. And I think Nintendo will continue to take advantage of it. And it varies per region, of course. In America, the stuff is becoming even more like scant at this point. There's less of it around. But then in Europe, there's still a decent amount of store presence for games. And in Japan, there's a ton. Like, it's huge. Like, people buy a lot of stuff on physical media. Like when Dragon Quest 3, the remake, shipped, they actually like ran out of copies to sell. Like, they sold through the initial, batch of games that they produced. They could have sold more for sure. Yeah. It's still traditional in that way. So yeah, digital's big, but there's still a market for physical games. And I think Nintendo is smart to leverage that. And that's going to continue to be a point of success for them.